Good afternoon, good morning, perhaps, everybody. I welcome you in the name of the Geneva Macro Labs to our today's online talk, which will be on international trade and the effects of COVID-19 on it. I am Marianne Schörling. I'm leading the engagement of stakeholders at the Geneva Macro Labs, and I will be your moderator tonight for this 60-minute session. And I would like to set first the stage for our discussion before I will be introducing our distinguished speakers. First, a big thank you for all of you who have joined us tonight in this time of holiday season. It's very special to us that you are with us tonight, because it's you who are bringing life and reflection into our think and do tank that aims for accelerating progress towards a sustainable future for all. And because diversity, interdisciplinary collaboration is essential for our work, we aim for covering topics topics in our webinars that allow for conversation across countries, sectors, and professions. And on that note, we're extremely delighted that you are tuning now in from all over the world. We started in March with our webinar series, and now, we read that you're joining us from Toronto, from South Africa, from Kenya, from Switzerland, from the States. So thank you for your interest. I will now share the first slide with you. Let's go into presentation mode here. That's a bit too fast. So again, all right. So last week we discussed the fiscal policy responses to COVID-19 and related states' capacities. And today we will stay in the field of international economics, but our focus will be on trade dynamics due to the pandemic. Now, the traditional view of international trade was that each country produces goods and offers services that are exported as final products to consumers abroad. However, in today's global economy, I think this type of trade only represents around 30% of all trade in goods and services. In reality, about 70% of international trade today involves global value chains. Now, international trade and investment are pivotal for a future economic and financial recovery plan, but the pandemic has led to trade restrictions, disrupted supply chains, and reduced global trade volumes. The WTO and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, where our today's speakers work, project massive declines, such as in world merchandise trade and global foreign direct investment inflows, reaching the lowest level in 2 decades. So now one central question is, how is the geography of trade changing and where are we heading to? And this brings us to our agenda. We are very pleased to welcome today 2 highly distinguished speakers, both based in Geneva, active in roles of global reach, and also members of our Think and Do Tank. Thank you for your support. Our first speaker will be Emmanuelle Ganne. Emmanuelle is Senior Analyst in the Economic Research and Statistics Division of the WTO, where she leads her organization's work on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises and blockchain. She also conducts research on SMEs, global value chains, services, and digital technologies. And since I know there are some of you here who are blockchain experts, Emmanuelle is also the author of a book called Can Blockchain Revolutionize International Trade?, where she was building a bridge between entrepreneurs and the IT community on the one hand and trade officials on the other. Our second speaker will be Dr. Jörn Hoffmann. Jörn is head of trade logistics, Trade Logistics branch at the United Nations Conference on Trade Development, UNCTAD, which leads the organization's work on international transportation and trade facilitation. I will share more about his background before his presentation, and he will give us some insights and policy recommendations on the logistics of international trade. Now, both speakers will have around 10 minutes for the presentation, and we will then have about 30 minutes for an open discussion. And my colleague Jörn Erbguth, our head of technology insight, will navigate us through the Q&A session. As a gentle reminder, please make sure that you use the chat if you have a question during the presentation, but you can also post them during the Q&A session. All right, Emmanuelle, so you will share with us some broader reflections on what happened within different dimensions of international trade since we started our fight against the pandemic. Governments responded to the trade disruptions, but what more could be done to alleviate the trade and economic impact of this dramatic crisis? We're looking forward to your thoughts, and I will now share your slides.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. And thank you for setting the scene. Can you hear me? I heard something. No, okay.
Yes.
I can start. So just waiting for the slides to be uploaded. And I will start by giving an overview of the impact of the current crisis on international trade, and then move on to some policy actions and policy recommendations. So this year is very special for all of us. A virus hit the world, and that virus has also hit international trade. Now, world trade fell very sharply. Let me see whether I can actually move the slides. I'm losing them. Can you see my slides? Sorry, because I don't see them on the screen. Seem to have a problem with the... Are they uploaded?
They're uploaded and we can see it. Let me just do that for you.
Yes, sorry, because I can't see it.
I
don't know what happened.
If you just stop with using the mouse for a second, then I can take over.
Apologies for that.
No problem.
I saw the first slide and then it disappeared.
Yeah, so now it should be back again.
Yeah, can I try? Oh, let me maybe
try
disable the mouse. Let me see whether it works now.
Yeah.
Yes, it seems to work. Sorry for that.
No
So yes, so world trade fell very sharply in the first half of this year, and this is what you can see here on that chart. A big drop. According to our estimates, we set out two possible scenarios, one in which world trade would fall by around 13%, which is the optimistic scenario that you can see in green on that screen. But the more pessimistic scenario foresees a decline in world trade, volume of merchandise trade, by more than 30%, actually 32%. So these declines are historically large. But they could actually have been worse than that if governments hadn't stepped in. And I will come back to the type of measures that they have taken to try and support business and try and help the economy. Now, looking ahead to next year, we also, in our latest trade forecast, envisage two scenarios, one in which trade could go back to pre-pandemic trends, the pre-pandemic trade being the one in yellow dotted. But that would imply a growth of world trade of about 20%. And what may be the more likely scenario is a slower recovery of world trade, whereby world trade would grow by 5%, which would still leave it below the pre-pandemic levels. Now, of course, the lockdown that has affected many economies around the world, and that is still affecting many economies around the world, has had a major impact on supply chains. As Marianne was saying, about 3/4 of world trade happens through value chains. Most of them are global supply chains, or at least regional supply chains. And so we've seen major disruptions. The fact that China, for example, stopped producing for a few weeks, China being the largest manufacturer, has trickled down the chain. And some countries, India, for example, couldn't produce essential medicines because they couldn't source active ingredients from China. But even when it was possible to produce, one big problem was that it was very difficult to ship the goods. And you have here, sorry, I have some problems with the slides that I'm trying to, I don't know what's happening. So the second one doesn't want to stay, okay. Okay, it seems to stay now. Sorry for that. So what we saw was a big flight disruptions, and about 40% of freight is actually transported in commercial flights. And you can see here on the graph the big impact of the lockdown in March 2020 compared to the previous year. So it meant that even when those goods were produced, they could not necessarily be shipped. And the same thing happened with cargo. Now we saw here a decline of about 3/4 of commercial flights between January and April. But the good news is that we see some sort of rebound, a slight rebound right now. So this is something to watch, but that is easing the impact on trade. Now, talking about container, as I said, there was also a very sharp decline in the number of containers between January and January 2007. You have it here. And starting so in early 2020, a slight rebound now, but this has impacted world trade quite significantly and has had a big impact on shipping rates, which have climbed significantly in between March and May. And you can see here this is the blue line, which is this year, in May, the huge increase in terms of shipping rates, which also affects world trade, of course, quite significantly. So it's no surprise in this context that exports have fallen very steeply since the beginning of the year. And you can see here, both in terms of manufacturing, in terms of exports, the huge decline earlier this year. This being said, here again, some good news in the sense that if you look at the very end of the chart, you can see that it is going up again. Now, looking at automobile sales, the good news is that purchases of automobiles and of some other consumer durables, after a very steep declines, are here again going up. In China, the increase is quite significant. In the case of the US and Western Europe, it's still declining, but to a lesser extent. The fact, nevertheless, that we seem to see an upward trend on all these different aspects shows that there is, signals some renewed consumer confidence. So let's hope that we are on a better trajectory now after the big hit that world trade got during the first quarter and a bit more of this year. So decline very steep, but what our latest trade forecasts show is that this decline is probably unlikely to reach the worst case scenario that I had shown on the first slide, that was the minus 32%. So we'll probably be somewhere between minus 13 to 32%, but it won't reach that worst case scenario. And part of the reason is that there was very rapid government responses that helped temper the contraction of world trade. And I'll go over some of the measures taken by governments. But what has in a way made the headline at the beginning were actually all the export prohibitions on the right. So you will tell me, yeah, but this is actually hurting trade. Yes, indeed. According to the trade monitoring report that we just published, that is focused on the G20, the one for the WTO-wide membership will be published very soon in the coming days. But according to the G20 report that looks at these different the different prohibitions put in place, there are about 85 countries that have put in place either export prohibitions or restrictions, including a number of non-members. The vast majority of these export restrictions actually focus on the famous PPE, the personal protection equipment, like face and eye protection, protective garments and gloves. But there are also some other products like sanitizers, not surprisingly, and foodstuff. Now, the good news is that in the trade monitoring report that we just published, as I said, if you look at the balance of trade facilitating versus trade restrictive measures, you can see that the trade facilitating measures, which are in purple on that slide, are actually in greater number than the trade restrictive measures, which means that on average, governments have actually, as a response to the crisis, tried to facilitate trade. Yes, they have put in place a number of export restrictions, especially on these PPE equipments. But besides that, they have taken a number of measures to facilitate trade. And if you look at the second graph at the bottom of the screen, what this graph shows, what these bars show, is that most of these trade facilitating measures are actually related to the COVID-19 crisis. So governments have stepped in to try and support trade and limit the impact of the crisis on trade. Now, one of the actors that has been significantly affected by international trade are the small businesses, MSMEs, which are really at the center of the crisis. Now, MSMEs are the backbone of the world economy. They represent 95% of companies worldwide. They account for 60% of employment. So if they suffer, it's the whole world economy that suffers. There have been a number of different surveys and studies that have looked at the impact of the current crisis on MSMEs, and all of them conclude that all MSMEs are affected, but 50 to 60% are severely affected. And a number of them, about half of them, are actually of risk of being put out of business in less than, well, 3 months on average, but now it can be a matter of weeks because the crisis has been with us for quite some time already. And why are they so much affected? Because, well, they are more fragile, they have more limited capacities, limited borrowing capacities, but also because of their disproportionate presence in the sectors that are the most affected by social distancing measures and transport disruptions, like accommodation, for example, or food services, restaurants that were closed for a very long time. So SMEs, I mean, the current crisis has added to existing challenges that SMEs face, but because of their disproportionate presence in the sectors most affected, they are really hit very hard by the current crisis, and especially the very small businesses and the youngest workers are hit particularly strongly. Access to trade finance is becoming increasingly difficult as well for these companies. What we've seen is a rush by governments to support businesses, and in particular small businesses. And what we've been doing in the context of the informal working group on MSMEs at the WTO is to try and map the measures that governments have been taking to try and support small businesses. And what we see is that governments have been taking 4 types of measures. First, the urgent liquidity measures, backstop measures to support MSMEs and try to address cash flow issues, because MSMEs have very limited cash flow. So vast majority of the measures we found, there are 150 members covered in that mapping, show that members have taken liquidity measures, and you can see here almost all of them actually have taken liquidity measures. A number of them have also taken trade support measures, so measures to expand trade opportunities for small businesses. For example, market information support, market access support, access to standards free of cost, etc. There are also a number of members that have taken resilience-focused measures to help SMEs, for example, go digital, which is critical in the current context when you have to work from home. And some measures also to smoothen the business environment. So it's more a postponement of corporate obligations, business registration and licensing being eased, etc. And so we've been taking a number of measures at the WTO itself to monitor the type of measures taken by members, be they export restrictions or measures to support MSMEs, for example, or support companies. But our members have also been very active, and there are more than a dozen statements and proposal documents that have been circulated and that are posted on the WTO website. These statements call for markets to remain open, in particular agricultural markets, to refrain from introducing export prohibitions, restrictions, in particular on medical and agricultural products. And the principle of measures being targeted, proportionate, transparent, temporary, science-based, and consistent with WTO rules is repeated in a number of these statements. And also the principle of exercising restraint in establishing food stocks. There are also a number of calls for greater transparency, and in particular for members to notify their measures, the measures that they take related to COVID to the WTO, so that there is greater transparency. And a lot of different clauses on trade facilitation, the importance of taking full advantage of the trade facilitation agreement, of expediting customs clearance, of encouraging the use of electronic means for customs processing, of expediting and facilitating the flow and transit of essential goods. And these statements have been submitted by a wide range of members. You have an APEC statement, ASEAN statement, an LDC statement, an African group statement, a Cairns group statement, an Ottawa statement. There are some statements on specific issues, a statement on MSMEs, for example. And what these statements also do is put the spotlight on the importance of digitalization, that digitalization is critical and that we need to strengthen and to prioritize the work on digitalization. And then you have also a number of references in some of the statements only on essential movement of people, cooperation arrangements to ensure operation of logistics networks. And I know that Jan will talk about that, reinvigorate negotiations on agriculture for those members very interested in these issues. The African statements refers to IP, and the statements by developing countries refer to the importance also of global cooperation and coordination in this time of crisis, and the importance of technical assistance to help those countries recover from the crisis and build resilience in the longer term. So yeah, this is in essence an overview of what our members at the WTO have been saying, how they have reacted to the crisis, both in terms of actual measures that they've put in place, but also in terms of statements that they've made, given the considerable impact of the current crisis on international trade. Thank you very much. And I've put here the link to the WTO COVID-19 page if you want to go and have a look at it.
Thank you, Emmanuelle. That was great, and you really went into some interesting details. And it was a good snapshot, I would say, of the current scene. And considering that we have over 40 participants tonight, it shows that it's really an important topic to touch on. I encourage all of the participants to further explore the reports of the organization of the WTO, and just have pasted into the chat the link that you had on your last slide, Emmanuelle. So you made a strong point about looking at MSMEs, which is indeed at the center of the crisis. And in the EU, SMEs account for more than 99%, right? In Africa, it's up to 90%. So they play a major role. And I would like to make the point that in particular in developing countries, they play a critical role. And seeing that over half of them was severely affected by the crisis shows that we are in critical times for trade facilitation, and digitalization might be one way to move forward. And in this regard, I would like to move to our second speaker. I've already mentioned Jan Hoffmann is the head of the trade logistic branch at UNCTAD in Geneva. And yeah, before he moved to Switzerland, he worked for the UN's Regional Commission in Chile and for the International Maritime Organization in London. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Jan worked in academia, import-export, and for a family shipping business. He has studied in Germany, UK, and Spain, and holds a PhD in economics from Hamburg. So Jan, we're looking forward to your presentation now on logistics and resilient facilitation of goods transportation. The floor is yours, and we're looking forward to hear your thoughts.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Welcome to my home office telecommuting. And I think what I will share very nicely complements what Emmanuelle has shared. We do a lot of work together with WTO on trade facilitation. So let me click the green button on share screen and see if this works as planned. You should now be seeing something that says the logistics of international trade in times of COVID-19. And this should now be bigger. So the logistics of international trade, times of COVID, looking especially at shipping. And there are two ways that shipping and COVID are related. One thing is, of course, that transport is affected by the crisis. And the other one is that transport is necessary to overcome the crisis. Although I'm not saying here, we are not talking about post-COVID, we had some discussions. I think this will stay for quite some time. But, well, we need to live with the crisis. So let us start with a couple of slides only, or 2 or 3, on how transport is affected by the crisis. And there I find we can really get some interesting insights from shipping data. What you see here on the screen is data from port calls based on AIS, satellite information from ships. So you really know at this very moment how many ships are where, going at what speed, which ports, and so on. And this also helps with some forecasts and nowcasts where we do not have yet the trade statistics, because customs, finance, whatever, they report always with certain weeks or months delay. But we know, thanks to satellites, where are the ships now, how far are they going. This helps to do some of the forecasts, including some of the very pessimistic ones that UNCTAD and WTO have done. Emmanuelle showed some of them. And probably they're a bit too pessimistic, but that could be something for discussion later. So in this chart, I find very interesting to see the brown line are the passenger ships, and they really went down much more than other ship types, which shows what is really affected is the people, the movement of people in this time of pandemic. Then the one that second most went down is the blue line, which is tankers, oil, wet bulk, then dry bulk, and the containers went down first quite a lot, the big red line, and then came back almost. So this is data up to 2 or 3 weeks ago, quite timely weekly data. If you want to look at this by country, for each and every country in the world, it's difficult to show this in one chart. So here we have a very nice map done by one of my sons. Here we have a very proud daddy showing off the visuals done by Julian with data from marine traffic. So in this movie I will share with you, a 40-second movie, you can see for every country of the world 3 things. First, the size of the country relative in container ship calls. So you see China is the biggest. You will secondly see how it goes up or down from week to week, the size goes up or down, and the colors, the third part, shows you how the country stands vis-a-vis last year, same period 12 months ago. And that is then what we would attribute to COVID. So let me start the little movie, and you see how beginning of the year countries were greenish, yellowish, and I will share the PowerPoint with the video so you can replay it, look at your country. You see the week there, 23rd March, week of 30 March, and so on. And then you see how Europe later than Asia turned red, and Asia, especially China, then coming June, turned more green again. And I find this is a nice illustration of what is happening in trade and in shipping. And based on this, then we try to do the nowcast, forecast, and so on. Emmanuelle also showed 2 interesting charts which really complement this. This chart here is the supply, that's the ships. And Emmanuelle also showed demand, like movement of containers, and freight rate. So the movement of container actually went down even more than the supply. Now, I guess some of you are economists, you would think if supply is more than demand, then freight rates should go down, no? I mean, there's more supply than demand, prices should go down. And in reality, as Emmanuelle showed, freight rates have gone up. They have been very stable. There's a lot of discussion these days that people say there's too much of an oligopoly, monopoly, capacity management, the shipping lines successfully managing capacity to avoid bankruptcy. So depending on which side you are, you may be happy or not happy about the high freight rates. I think overall it shows a certain more matureness, more rational behavior on the side of the shipping lines, that they don't want another Hanjin, another bankruptcy. Okay, for the sake of time, let us move to the next part, which is now what transport needs to do to overcome the crisis. So here we have developed, we call it a policy brief, a 10-point action plan, which basically goes along the supply chain. Geographically, you start with the ships, go to the ports, leave the port, cross the country, cross the border, go to a transit country, have information portals, and so on. So if we start with the uninterrupted shipping, I guess you have also seen in the news, and it's really bad how seafarers are being treated, how they're stuck on the ship. Seafarers are critical personnel for whom teleworking is not possible. So governments need to allow the crews board the ships or are repatriated. And that's quite a big topic. We've done some joint statements between UNCTAD and the IMO and so on. Of course, ports need to remain open. We have some technical note there on how very practical, down-to-earth things, how port operations need to work as much as possible, automated, to protect the port workers, protect the population, but still keep functioning. Initially, in our technical note, one of the points was, be careful, don't let the seafarers leave the ship. Now that contradicts point one I just made. So we took that point off because the International Charter of Shipping actually complained, and they were absolutely right. And we are really now saying, please, dear dock workers, help your colleagues on the ships. There are special trade facilitation measures for critical goods, express treatments for specific health and so on. And so you can work with the World Customs Organization, identifying which ones are those goods, which treatment should be applied to them. A lot of special cross-border transport facilitation. The problem are not the trucks or the trains or the planes, the problem are the transport workers. And for air transport, actually, a lot of the cargo is transported as belly cargo in the passenger ships, not ships, sorry, I have such a distorted mind, always thinking ships, passenger aeroplanes. And now that aeroplanes for passengers no longer fly, there's also less space for cargo. Landlocked countries are particularly concerned. They depend on the seaports of neighboring countries, and we have some really serious problems, long waiting lines at the borders of, say, Zambia, Botswana, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, where we work and try to get the countries together to coordinate, to mutually accept tests, and so on and so forth. So all this requires information. One of our projects is about trade information portals to continuously update what are the current requirements if you want to import, export cross borders. And the key point for basically everything here is go paperless. So physical contact between people needs to be minimized, electronic submissions, paperless transaction become ever more important. Processes need to be dematerialized. A lot of the tools we have been selling for decades, I dare, about automation, pre-arrival processing, electronic payment, single windows, and so on and so forth, they are now really even more important. And I think Emmanuelle showed a nice chart there. There was the pink, the lila, and sorry, you know, males have less colors in the head than women. So I don't, whatever the darker color that showed that there are more trade supporting measures these days, and a lot of these went in this direction. There are legal implications if contracts cannot be fulfilled. I think a case can be made that governments may provide financial backup where necessary. By the same token, we want to protect the shippers from the carriers, from the service providers, but we also want to protect the service providers. A lot of discussion there. Shipping lines often are flagged abroad. They are international. Who should subsidize or not subsidize? So far, I think it is a good sign that services have been maintained. There have been some so-called blank sailings, but overall, I think the shipping industry has responded well. And all these areas now require technical assistance from the ship to the port to the transit, where we are working with a number of programs. One key last message I want to highlight, when you see these types of problems and trade facilitation and COVID and protecting the population, people like to show a balance. I've also had colleagues of Emmanuelle from the WTO show a PowerPoint with a balance, and I always get up angry and say, wrong message, wrong picture. None of the measures that we are promoting, nothing in our 10-point action plan says you should not control. We provide the tools, we recommend the collaboration, the dematerialization, digitalization that helps achieve both, protect the population get the goods through, but also, yeah, facilitate and get the goods through. That's my main message and sales pitch in this presentation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jan. That was fantastic, deep as well. And I would like to add to our audience that the report that you were referring to at the very beginning kind of summarizes the policy measures you've mentioned. And I just posted for you the link in the chat as well. So we are starting now our famous Q&A session. And for that, I encourage you to either continue posting your questions in the chat or take the floor. And it will be now my colleague Jörn Erbguth who will navigate us through the next 30 minutes.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you to both speakers for their excellent presentations. We already have a couple of questions. Let me allow one remark. When in January I heard the first news about car manufacturers being forced to shut down their plants because they didn't have enough supply, it looked much bleaker than it actually was. So I think global trade reacted quite well, and at least in some instances. Also, of course, the situation is very bad for many. I've seen one question by Philip Norley, or two questions about the data. Maybe Philip, you can pose your question yourself. Philip, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi everyone. So I'm asking the question. So first of all, to say what an excellent presentation, very informative. Very glad to be part of the discussion. So I work on the Foreign and Commonwealth Office UK Global Trade Programme. I'm the Customs and Trade Facilitation Lead. And as we go about designing our interventions under the Global Trade Programme, we are trying to build our evidence base, and in particular around disaggregated data that evidences impacts of the pandemic. You know, let's say this is the forum for talking about the pandemic, but how the pandemic is impacting, as we've seen on the statistics there, on small and medium enterprises. But also we look for how it may impact on those women-owned businesses. We know that they can have particular vulnerabilities, women-owned businesses. They can also have other responsibilities, family responsibilities, that make them particularly vulnerable to the effects of a drop in international trade due to the pandemic. So, and I know that there is much going on in the international forum around gathering such data, and the World Bank, etc. So it's always interesting to me to see sources and what is going on to get that kind of granular detail that exposes the real impact of the pandemic, not just generally on MSMEs, those that may be trading domestically, but also in particular those that are trading either directly or indirectly in international trade. So that's really where my question was coming from. Thank you.
So I guess, Emmanuelle, will you first take the floor and answer?
I guess it's a question for me. And no, very good question, which touches upon a very tough nut to crack, and a very difficult question, because data on SMEs or MSMEs is very scattered. First, there is no definition of what an MSME is at the global level. So that makes it even more complex, because different countries have different definitions. Some will say it's up to 50 people, some others up to 250. If you look at China, they have, I think, something like 10 or a dozen even definitions depending on the sector. So it makes it very challenging to have general numbers. What is very challenging as well is to have, as you were saying, disaggregated data. And what we do is that we rely on, for example, the World Bank Enterprise surveys that you mentioned. Various surveys, there have been many surveys that have been published and conducted in the first 2 months of the pandemic to try and better assess the impact of the crisis on MSMEs. But getting really the granular data is difficult. So the data we currently have has all these limitations and does not have the level of granularity that we would love to have. We are trying to find sources to have better data. So we're in discussion with a number of organizations and companies, but this is not something that can happen overnight. So we're well aware of the limitations, but the data on SMEs have many limitations, and we have to deal with that. The best we can get to get a sense is to look at different surveys that have been conducted and that show indeed that MSMEs are impacted significantly, and that, as you were saying, women-owned MSMEs are even more impacted than other MSMEs. Just like the smaller businesses are more impacted than the medium or bigger businesses.
Thank you, Emmanuelle. We are getting a lot of questions, so please try to be brief in your question and in your answer. There is a question to Jan from Razun. Yeah, Razun, will you take the floor, please?
Thank you very much. Are you listening me, Jörn?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. My question is to Jörn. Firstly, introduce myself. I am conducting PhD in intermodal transport, and actually we are the major exporter of ready-made garments to the world. So we need a good shipping connectivity and the last mile destination problems from port to the hinterland. That is, there is no intermodal facilities. So UNCTAD needs to play a big role to develop our intermodal system as well as support to the landlocked countries like Nepal and Bhutan. So I'm asking to the Jen, is there any plan of UNCTAD or World Trade Organizations for developing intermodal chain to the South Asian countries, especially from Bangladesh? That means Chirang port to the others country like Nepal, Bhutan, and 7 sister states of India. And that's basically landlocked. Thank you very much.
Yeah, let me give it a quick try. I would also like to very briefly respond to Philip and thank UK for supporting UNCTAD's work, which could link then to the second question, how and with whom could we help Nepal and Bhutan? Maybe UK can provide even further funding. We appreciate UK's support directly to UNCTAD trade facilitation reforms, also through Trade Markets Africa. We collaborate with UK funding, with UK customs. And on the data, we don't have data, of course, on the SMEs. The shipping data, as I tried to share, is really very, very interesting. First, for the sector itself. And secondly, because it helps actually to give information on what's happening with the real economy. So I had shared with you some data from AIS, which is from marine traffic. We have another good partnership with MDS Transmode about the shipping schedules, the timetables, which also provide a lot of insight about the network. And then we come inland, and that is true, it's difficult to get data. We actually had projects in Nepal and Bhutan and Bangladesh with India supporting transit, coming to agreements. UNCTAD, to be honest, we can only we are headquarters based. If you want to work really with investment infrastructure, you have to work with the Asian Development Bank or World Bank. But we have a program to support transit coordinators. We have programs, as you know, in your countries, we have Asikuda customs automation. So if you say, could we help? Yes, we'd love to. Send us a request, and then together we try to find the money.
Thank you very much, Jen.
Thank you. Mary, I think you have a question which is a little bit related regarding developing countries. Could you take the floor, please? Mary?
Mary. Please.
Okay, so Mary is, so I read the question myself. Thanks so much for the presentation. How can developing countries boost confidence in trade and global markets in order to keep the supply chain flowing? I think this is for both speakers, more for Jan maybe.
No, that's a difficult question. That's for Emmanuelle.
Thank you, Jan.
No, it's really like the confidence. It is true. Confidence is an important part. Business confidence, investment. The UNCTAD investment report was just launched a few weeks ago, and that always reconfirms the chicken and egg question again about how do we get out of this through certain confidence. Now, how do we build up the confidence, protecting people, maybe wearing masks and not make it a political issue not to wear a mask or this type of thing. I'm really, I think what we do, what I try to share this project to support with the digitalization, with making things work, further investment in these reforms, would then also encourage people to continue investing and trading. It's a very vague answer, I'm afraid, and not much more I could say.
Okay, thank you, Bob. There are also questions concerning the perspective of trade, but this, you have a quite a good question. Could you please take the floor?
Yes, yeah, thank you, Jörn. Yeah, thanks for sharing such interesting information and analysis. Just would like to highlight, we saw a few days ago, USA decided to go out from WHO. This is an unprecedented decision since half of century. That shows there is a big change of paradigm, in my opinion, and the international trade model of globalism is now being into question. So the question is, if we are taking into account the ecological and social stake behind the model, do you think there will be a return to normal as we knew it or not? And do you think we need to rethink the current model of globalization to meet these new challenges? Thanks.
So, Emmanuelle, would you like to take the floor first?
Yeah. First, about your point about the fact that the USA left the WTO. No, it's WHO. There have been discussions about them leaving the WTO. We're not there yet, and I hope we won't get to that point. But it's true that there are big question marks about multilateralism and the involvement of certain big parties in multilateral organizations. And so this whole idea of globalization, working together to try to make things better. Now, are we going to see a return to normal? I mean, it's difficult to know. I would love to have a crystal ball. What I think is that the current crisis has been a wake-up call. And I doubt there will be a complete return to normal. I mean, it has shown that we can go digital. I mean, there are some tools that we had been trying to introduce for a very long time. And now from one day to another, because we had no choice, because we had to work from home, we use those tools. And we saw also when it comes to international trade, for example, that a number of businesses went digital from one day to another because they had no choice. They had no staff in the office. They couldn't print documents. They couldn't sign documents. So banks, for example, who for a number of them had been reluctant about going digital, well, they took measures to expand digital channels to recognize e-signatures, e-documents, etc. So I think there is a clear move towards digitalization, which I think is good news also for like sustainability and the environment when you think about it. If you have less paper, you want to ship a container from Mombasa to the port of Rotterdam and you end up with a pile of paper that is 25 centimeters high. Hopefully we won't have that anymore, but we're not there yet. In order to get there, we have the technology, but we also need to put in place the regulatory environment. And I think governments need to put more attention to that and activate efforts to truly move towards digitalization, because you can have all the digital tools that allow you to go digital. If there's no recognition of e-signatures, of e-documents, if you can't do things digitally because the law prevents you from doing it, then you won't be able to truly digitalize trade. There have been some great efforts being made, a lot of progress, and Jan mentioned the automation of customs, etc. But for the moment, there is still no digitalization along the entire supply chain. And this is something that we still need to work on, I believe, at a regulatory level. There are some discussions at the WTO on e-commerce about recognition of e-signatures and e-documents, for example. Transposing the UNCTAD MLETR would also be very useful for the digitalization of a key document, which is the bill of lading. But I want to keep it short because I know that time is passing.
Thank you.
Jan, do you want to maybe we?
I try to be brief. For me, what was described, this threat challenge to the multilateralism, yes, absolutely, it's there. I think it's part of two major trends. One is called populism, called whatever you want, more protectionism waves, which hopefully go back. Another one is the big picture of the decoupling of the Chinese and more North America West in technology, in trade agreements, in social media, and be it Huawei, be it TikTok. It's not really news, but it's a very important slow trend, which I think has a big, in my view, not good impact on global trades, multilateralism. UNCTAD used to highlight the need for policy space for the smallest and poorest and the least developed countries, not to be bound too much by a rules-based system, because for them it's much more difficult. In the current situation, I hear from my colleagues, big bosses, a lot of emphasis also on the importance to keep and save the multilateral rules-based system. I hope that WTO colleagues feel the support also. WTO, WHO, same thing. So I find it is very, very worrying what we observe. And
being also in blockchain, I think the needed regulatory environment needs multilateralism, otherwise it doesn't work. So we have a comment from Tom regarding electronic and digital documents. Could you take the floor, please, Tom?
Yes, thanks. Just a short point, picking up on some of the points made earlier about trade facilitating measures and the use of electronic documents. One thing that's happened in the corona environment is that the use of e-phyto, electronic phytosanitary certificates, has been accelerating. And what was happening was, with the paper document, it wasn't arriving because flights were delayed or flights were cancelled. So goods were being held up at the border, and for fresh fruit and vegetables, this is a disaster. So some countries like the US have said, okay, if you've got e-phyto, we will accept e-phyto, and we will accept a fax or a paper copy of the phytosanitary certificate, and thus the goods were cleared rather than being stuck at the border, which otherwise would have happened. So some of the work that we've been doing over the years now is bearing fruit, and I think this is very positive. Hopefully this will happen with more electronic documents that will help us through this environment and then be prolonged into the future.
Thank you. We have a question concerning embargoes by Joel. Joel, would you please take the floor?
Yes, thank you. Now, it's just a question, obviously, we have at the same time the COVID itself, the pandemic, and at the same time we have trade wars between different countries. What is the respective impact of those two events happening nearly at the same time?
So,
can I answer?
Yes, please, Emmanuelle.
Yes, I mean, obviously, the two have a cumulative impact on world trade, no doubt about that. If you look at I think it was my second slide, you can see that the trade wars predate the COVID crisis. So what we had seen last year and the year before is indeed an impact of these trade wars and embargoes on trade, in the sense that trade didn't grow as much as it used to. It used to grow twice as fast as GDP, and we were more at the same level as GDP or even slightly below. But if you look at the second slide I had, you can see that there's a huge drop in the first quarter of this year. And this drop is clearly linked to the COVID crisis. Why? Because you had a lockdown, because you had a number of countries taking export restriction measures, etc. No production, big drop in the number of containers, flights, etc. So the COVID crisis is really what explains that big drop that you can see on this slide. And to have a better idea of the impact of those trade wars, just look at the year before on that slide.
Yeah, thanks very much, Emmanuelle.
Thank you. We have another question concerning the long-term impact by Michelle. Would you please take the floor, Michelle?
Sorry, thank you for the opportunity. My question was about whether this pandemic will have any effect to rebalancing production of goods and therefore reduce our dependencies from transport. It looks evident that now we depend very much heavily from transport. Do you think there will be any effect in the long term of repositioning or moving production from one place to another in order to reduce these dependencies? Thank you.
Yeah, I can give it a try. It seems like an obvious thing, and so in order not to depend on input from far away that needs a lot of transport, there are no planes and so on. But in practice, what was the first thing that we were missing all of a sudden, what we were afraid of? It was the toilet paper, it was some soap, or it was services that were closed down, that were very close by. It was more, I saw the difference more in whether it was a people-based, services-based that had the obstacle, you could no longer move, touch, work, and not so much the international transport. Yes, of course, there were obstacles at the borders, and there were things were not moving by plane, so they had to go by train, and then the train was stuck between Russia and White Russia or whatever. But I think the more rational solution, which I expect and hope will be taken, is not so much to trade less, but maybe to diversify. So that's more the solution. You try not to depend on one or two providers. You may remember, okay, I like photography. There was a time all of a sudden Nikon could no longer produce because all of one input for the cameras came from Bangkok, which was flooding. So, okay, maybe you should have diversified and not depend on this input from one place. So overall, I hope we will still continue to trade, which would need transport. This whole idea of slow food or local production, I know even some UN colleagues have published this, and I wrote them angry mails and that is wrong. If you dig out coal in South Africa that is at the surface, that costs much less energy and CO2 emissions and whatever than digging it out from 100 meters below the ground in Germany. If you plant tomatoes in Spain, it's still better than planting them in Switzerland. So this local production is not something that convinces me as a general thing. One has to really look case by case.
If I may jump in, I mean, I agree
Yes,
with Jan about the issue of diversification. I think what this crisis will probably result in is less emphasis being put on cost as the primary factor in developing a supply chain, and more emphasis being put on developing secure production chains where you diversify and where you don't put all your eggs in the same basket. Now, in terms of global value chains, I mean, you talk about global value chains, but as a matter of fact, over the past few years, what we've seen is more a regionalization of value chains, except for some products that are highly complex and where you indeed have components being sourced from all over the places. But if you look at our global value chain development report that was published last year, you will see that we see more a regionalization than a true globalization of value chains.
Thank you. We are approaching the end. Last question, please, Duarte and Jan and Emmanuelle, please answer it with a finishing statement, with a perspective on trade and logistics. Thank you. So please, Duarte, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question. So regarding the pandemic and all these trends that were accelerated or introduced, we have telecommuting, or we also have the question of digitization. I just wanted to ask Jan and Emmanuelle, if apart from this, if you have, if you've seen one or two trends that can actually boost or facilitate trade in the long term, and what that is, and if you expect that then to be needed to be pushed by governments or organizations like yours, or if you see more in terms of adaptation that will be self-regulated or developed by private parties, either alone or in collaboration, like we see in some aspects, namely in shipping. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Jan, will you take the floor first?
Yeah, but I really have to pass self-regulation, how the industry, the private sector responds. What I only find here is really a lot of uncertainty on all sides, and I see a key role for the public sector, governments, but also a strong multilateral system to give stability so that the stakeholders can plan and respond, and hopefully we will not have such a bad decline. And I think that's what we are overdoing. I see really a lot of work. Most of us, and you are, a lot of are working more than normal from our home offices, responding to COVID. So we try our best to keep the system running. I know I'm not fully answering the answer, but it's more of a concluding remark then. I think obviously logistics, transport continues to be key. It's part of the solution. It's very much affected by the problem, but it's very much also part of the solution. So I think what we do, we trade in transport services in GATS at the WTO, or more the technical system research at UNCTAD is, well, I believe it's very important. That's why we do it.
Thank you, Jan. Emmanuelle.
Very rapidly, because we're running over time. I think that trade digitalization is the future of international trade. This current crisis has shown that we have to go digital. So what do we need to make it happen? One, we need global cooperation. You mentioned blockchain, for example. For that to happen, we need a global approach. So we'll need multilateralism. Two, we need to have a cross-sectoral approach. And three, we need to make sure that there is a public-private dialogue, because we can't develop solutions in silo. We need the regulators to talk with the private sector. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much for these great answers. And for the final statements, I give back to my colleague, Marianne, please.
Thank you, Jörn, and also thank you to you, Emmanuelle and Jan. That was a really versatile discussion. You answered some deep with deep thoughts on the difficult questions that we had, and I appreciate that technology was part of the solutions that you described in terms of policy measures that we hopefully will see in the future and that we're already seeing right now. So I hope that all of you, this to our audience, enjoyed our today's webinar. And as I've mentioned at the intro, we will make the recording available to you through our YouTube channel. Please leave a comment there. Our discussion doesn't have to end here tonight or this morning, but you can continue online to engage with us. I will just share now our last slide. Hopefully you can see it. With the different channels that you can, now it doesn't show anymore. With the different channels you can get in touch with us. There is LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, but as well you can get in contact with us through email and our website. So this brings us to our upcoming webinar on the 15th of July, which will be a special edition one, and actually the last one before the summer break. It's special because, as Jörn has mentioned at the very beginning of our today's webinar, it will have a slightly different format. We will be able to enjoy 2 exclusive live music performances, which will complement our discussions. We will have a look at the creative and art sector, which was hardly hit, well, actually, which was hit very hard by the crisis. And thanks to innovation, the industry is becoming more resilient. So we will have the pleasure to welcome to this online talk a member of our Geneva Macro Labs community, Francesco Montesismondi, an SDG-focused entrepreneur and the recent hackathon winner. And he will share with us live his team's innovation called the Art Hub. And I would like to share the link with you just when I finish my presentation. Please note that registrations will not go through our usual Eventbrite page. Instead, please register through the link that I will share with you right now. And we will also publish all information on social media as usual. So I wish you a great rest of the week. Hope to welcome you to our last webinar next week, and hope you stay healthy and well. Thank you and have a good evening.